let's take a look at some of the most bloodthirsty dreadnoughts in the galaxy, the Furioso and the Death Company Dreadnought. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we try and get the most out of our miniatures on the battlefield. Today we'll be continuing our look at the Blood Angels with the Furioso and the Death Company Dreadnought. One's pretty mad and the other one's absolutely freaking livid. In this video we'll take a look at their datasheets, any obvious combos and buffs that we can give them, and how I would run them on the battlefield. In the background, the Furioso Dreadnoughts are the Blood Angels' particular pattern of dreadnoughts, particularly geared towards close combat, as is their wont. Many of their pilots are thousands of years old, but many are new with the recent events of the Blood of Baal, and the many grievously injured Blood Angels who have fought against the Tyranids. Death Company Dreadnoughts are Furioso Dreadnoughts that have fallen to the Black Rage, which swallows their years of wisdom into a howling madness, and transforms them into little more than a living battering ram, who has no desire but to hurl himself at the foe in a rage of destruction. So angry and even angrier. Let's take a look at their rules. So both the Furioso and the Death Company Dreadnought each received a 10 points drop in the new chapter approved, which certainly helps them. They're both Elite's choices for Codex Space Marines, so I believe at its cheapest cost the Furioso Dreadnought would cost 111 points, and the Death Company Dreadnought would be 121 points, so the Death Company Dreadnought is 10 points more expensive than the Furioso. They have a very decent stat line. They both have Movement 8, Weapon Skill and Ballistic Skill 3 up, Strength 6, Toughness 7, 8 wounds, 4 attacks, Leadership 8 and a 3 up save. So it's basically like a standard Dreadnought, but quite a bit faster with an extra 2 inches movement, which is pretty helpful on a mainly dedicated melee beast. I think we'll focus on the Furioso first and then discuss the differences that the Death Company Dreadnought brings. So in that cheapest possible loadout for the Furioso Dreadnought, you get a pair of Blood Talons, a Storm Bolter and a Melter Gun. The Storm Bolter and Melter Gun are built into the fist weapons. With the close combat weapons, you have the option of either sticking with Blood Talons or upgrading to Furioso Fists for 5 points extra. Blood Talons are Strength +4, AP -2, Flat Damage 3, and you can reroll failed hit and wound rolls for this weapon. So that's a spectacularly reliable weapon, its main weakness being that it's only AP -2. Because it's Strength 10 with the Blood Angels Red Thirst special rule, most of the time you'll be wounding on 2s rerolling and hitting on 3s rerolling. So on average you'll land round about 4 to 5 attacks that become successful wounds on pretty much any target in the game. Not bad at all. For 5 points extra, the Furioso Fists are upgraded to Strength ×2, so that's Strength 12, AP -3, again flat 3 damage, and this one has the special rule that if you're armed with 2 Furioso Fists, then you can re-roll the hit roll, but not the wound roll. So the main advantage for this one for me is its additional AP. Strength 10 versus 12 doesn't really matter in most circumstances. If we do a little math hammer, assuming that we get the charge and Red Thirst goes off, the Fists will put out an average of 9.2 damage on a knight, and the Talons will do an average of 8.6. To be honest, I'd say that that's so close that I would typically take the Talons over the Fists, just to save the extra 5 points. The extra tiny increase in efficiency isn't going to be worth it, and it won't be any increase at all. In fact, the Blood Talons will do better if your target has a decent invul, which a lot of good melee things do. So I'd probably go for the Talons over the Fists in an ideal world, but the difference is very small indeed. They're both great. You have the option to trade out the Storm Bolter or the Melter Gun for a Heavy Flamer. This will be a whopping increase in points over the Storm Bolter with 12 extra points. I personally wouldn't bother at all. 4 shots at 24 inches is really good compared with just 3.5 at 8 inches, even with a mild increase in strength and AP. For 12 extra points, it's really not worth the trade. And besides, if you're right next to them to use the Flamer, you're going to get to charge them anyway. So they might be able to deal with the threat in any case. It's a bit closer with the Melter Gun. I could happily either take the Flamer or the Melter Gun depending on which you want to tailor against, infantry or tanks. You do have the option to replace one of your Furioso Fists with a Frag Cannon, and I'm afraid that the way that it's worded means that you can only field it with a Frag Cannon and a Furioso Fist, not with a Blood Talon, which I thought was interesting but a little restrictive, to be honest. I don't know why they made that restriction. You can choose to take that instead of its Fist with the Storm Bolter or the Fist with the Heavy Flamer and Melter Gun. I think if it were me, I'd probably just ditch the extra fancy option and stick him with a Fist with Storm Bolter on one side and a Frag Cannon on the other side, just because the Storm Bolter is such good value for 2 points, and the other two are annoyingly short-ranged for such high-priced weapons. A Furioso with a Furioso Fist, Stormbolter and Frag Cannon will set you back 122 points, so still not the most expensive Dreadnought in the world. The Frag Cannon is unfortunately hampered by an 8-inch range. It's an Assault 2d6 weapon with Strength 6, AP -1 and Damage 1 that automatically hits the target, so it's sort of like a slightly buffed twin heavy flamer that's Strength 6 instead of Strength 5. I'm in two minds about the Frag Cannon really. On the one hand, it's not too bad to add a decent range threat, on top of your already considerable close combat abilities. On the downside, it does mean that you lose those sweet reroll hits in close combat, which will nerf its damage output there by about a quarter, but it still will be good, and you will gain a powerful shooting option, but then it does cost a little bit more. I've decided to change my mind while recording this one video. Seeing as the Frag Cannon has such a close profile to the Heavy Flamer, it might well be worth including another Heavy Flamer there, just as 10d6 auto hits is actually a legitimate threat to a horde, so I'd happily take either the Stormbolter or the Heavy Flamer in the other hand. I'm on the fence as to whether or not you should take the Frag Cannon or not. I think that with and without are fairly well balanced. Finally, you have the option to replace your smoke launchers, which are actually really quite good on a Furioso, as you can use them to give you an extra shield while you move up, when you probably wouldn't have been shooting weapons anyway. But you can replace that option with a Magna Grapple, and the Magna Grapple costs 5 points. Basically, if you charge a single vehicle with your Furioso, then you add +2 to the charge roll. This one's kind of a take or leave for me. I probably wouldn't bother. +2 inch to the charge is good, but it only applies against certain units, so you'll just have wasted points if you wind up fighting infantry for most of the game, or if your opponent keeps his vehicles out of charge range. If you expect to be fighting lots of vehicles though, then it's not such a bad buy. The only special rule that we've not mentioned is its Explode special rule, where on a 6 it'll hand out D3 mortal wounds to units within 3 inches, so a fairly small explosion. So overall, the Furioso is a very angry Dreadnought that wants to be charging headlong into the enemy battle lines. It can take an interesting horde clearance option in that Frag Cannon, most likely combined with a Heavy Flamer or Stormbolter, and he's going to ideally want to be charging enemy vehicles or elite infantry. So let's look at the other side then, the Death Company Dreadnought. He's 10 points more expensive, so what do we get for that? The answer is we gain 3 things and we lose 1 thing. The thing that we lose is the Frag Cannon. This isn't an option for the Death Company Dreadnought. Obviously they're so blood mad that they can't be bothered to even operate the simplest point-and-click ranged weapon, although they seem fine with melt guns somehow. So we only have the Furioso Fists and Blood Talons. The first thing we gain is Black Rage, which will give you a 6-up Feel No Pain, which is decently strong on big vehicles. It will make him 20% more durable over the course of the game. He'll also have +1 attacks to the charge, which again is a +20% to his melee output in the first round, which is also good. The second thing we gain is the Insatiable special rule. This means that he piles in 6 inches when consolidating at the end of the fight phase. This isn't particularly game changing, but it could be very handy if you say kill an enemy unit then want to consolidate to tie up something else. He'll just be a little bit better at doing that, and it's handy but not really a massive advantage over the Furioso. Finally, he gains the Death Company keyword, which allows him to have some interesting interactions with various stratagems and special characters. So overall, a decent amount more durable, a decent amount more fighty, consolidates better, and has a few more options for the cost of 10 points. To my mind, if you're not using the Frag Cannon, I'd say that this is quite a good reason to use the Death Company Dread. I'd say the single strongest advantage is that 6-up Feel No Pain, which means he's maybe a little bit more likely to make it to combat. Not much, but a small but decent buff. Before we move on, I've just spotted that he's also Leadership 7 when the Furioso is Leadership 8, so that could occasionally come into effect when you're talking about psychic powers and things. So let's have a look at a few combos that we can use with them on the table. Firstly, some character rerolls could be useful for the Dreadnoughts. Obviously, if you've got Blood Talons, you've already got all the rerolls you ever need, so don't bother buffing these guys with characters. But otherwise, if you're, say, running a Furioso with just 1 fist, Dante, Lieutenants, Captains, and others will all help. The Sanguinor could give them an extra attack, though it's not the most efficient use of his aura. Librarians could cast Unleash Rage for an additional attack, though again it's not the most efficient. Or if you have an allied Space Marine Librarian from the main codex, then they can still cast Might of Heroes on the Furioso, which is actually really quite strong. Lamates could allow a Death Company Dreadnought to reroll failed charges, and Chaplain Listeners could also help out the Dreadnoughts in close combat, though obviously not the reroll hits one, if you're using 2 of the combat weapons. Tech Marines could potentially repair them, and some relics can help them out a little bit. The first one that springs to mind is the Icon of the Angel to allow them to reroll charges from Blood of Baal. Also the Quake Bolts to have them hit on a 2-up in close combat, though it's not as good if they do have their full rerolls. It'd only be a minor buff. Blood Angels really do have a lot of close combat things to talk about. Moving on to stratagems now. Duty Eternal was a really important new role added in Blood of Baal, ported from the main Space Marine Codex. Halving the damage of incoming wounds on these things is a massive durability boost, and one of the best stratagems available to Space Marines for just 1 command points. Could be a real help seeing them make close combat. You could potentially use Refusal to Die for 1 command point on a Death Company Dreadnought, to make him a 5+ Feel No Pain for a turn as well, if you're absolutely sure that he's going to get hammered with a lot of heavy weapons. Unbridled Ardour could let a Dreadnought do a surprise heroic intervention if your opponent puts any units within 6 inches of them at the end of their charge phase, which if you ever get it to go off is possibly the most powerful stratagem Blood Angels have access to, for 1 command points anyway. Getting a free fight out of these guys would be absolutely nuts. Back to the main codex now, we've got Wisdom of the Ancients to let a Dreadnought function as a mini captain for a turn, giving out rerolls of 1 all around them. I believe Death Company Dreadnoughts can use that as well. Unfortunately, currently Honor the Chapter still has the old wording in the Blood Angels Codex. I don't know if they'll FAQ an update to keep it in line with the new Marines Codex, but it means that you can't fight again with your Blood Angels Dreadnoughts, which is a bit annoying, because these guys can really want to fight again sometimes. Finally, we'll just mention the Stormraven gunship. I remember when this thing was unique to Blood Angels, but now all the chapters are at it. Angry Bird, my big red Stormraven, still flies proud in his red colours though. Now the Stormraven has the opportunity to transport the Dreadnought, and it's most certainly a powerful option, but you have to bear in mind that you're putting a lot of eggs in one basket, and Stormravens are really quite fragile point for point. Sure, they have 14 wounds and -1 to hit, but if your opponent focuses their entire army on them, they will go down, and it can be extra worth it for your opponents to do that if they're carrying a Dreadnought inside them. I personally think that the Stormraven's just too expensive to use as a dedicated transport like this. You also need it to perform well as a gunboat too. It's certainly a formation that you can do, and it's very fun to drop a scary fighty Dreadnought into the midst of the enemy battle line, but I'm not sure it's the most absolutely optimal build that the Blood Angels Codex can do. Obviously the absolute biggest concern is if your opponent gets turn 1 and just guns the Stormraven down, then you've got a Dreadnought potentially sat at the very back of your deployment zone, which was the opposite of why you took the Stormraven in the first place, and at best you've got a couple of units that are reasonably easy to kill for their points, having to try and struggle to make back their investment over the course of the game. They just can't punch above their weight quite as well as some of, say, the Blood Angels jump pack infantry can, where they can decimate half the flank of an army in one charge. Don't get me wrong, it's a very fun tactic, but just not one that I've ever been tempted to try and do in tournament or competitive play. So let's talk about how I'd use the Furioso or Death Company Dreadnoughts on the battlefield. Firstly, if I was going with dual fists or dual talons, I would choose the Death Company Dreadnought as the first port of call, and choose the Furioso if I was fancying the Frag Cannon, which I would combine with either the Stormbolter or the Heavy Flamer. If I was foot-slogging them, I could happily run either 1, 2 or 3 of these. If you just have one, then it's a great target for Duty Eternal, and it'll soak up more enemy firepower, being the only Dreadnought that they can target. If you have 2 or 3, then it provides extra threat saturation, which means they'll have to invest quite a lot more if they don't want their units charged by a Dreadnought, and they certainly aren't going to be wanting to put any valuable units within reach. If we're foot-slogging them, I'd be putting them up on the edge of the deployment zone line, because they certainly aren't going to contribute to the battle in any meaningful way if they're loitering back in the deployment zone and miss out on a charge because the enemy are too far away. Having said that, you could potentially use them in a bit more of a counter-attack type role if you know the enemy is going to be coming to you, but that doesn't tend to be the case when you have Blood Angels. The Blood Angels tend to be the hyper-aggressive type army. If you have a lot of vehicles in the army, I'd certainly consider using prepared positions if you have the second turn. From there, we want to move towards the enemy, certainly thinking about advancing if it makes them get closer, and potentially popping smoke to give them a -1 to hit, to make them just that little bit more painful to remove from the table. I wouldn't be massively tempted to use many of the character options for support unless it's very convenient. I'd say probably the most efficient buffing units would probably be a lieutenant buffing some Fragioso Dreadnoughts, as both the Frag Cannon, Heavy Flamer and Furioso Fists will all benefit from the reroll 1s to wound, but character auras are quite hard to coordinate when it comes to charging units, particularly single model units like these dreadnoughts. Basically, you're going to want to deploy these front and centre, take control of the centre of the board, to hopefully make the opponent keep away from them as much as possible and give you the control of the board. They're not the slowest with 8-inch movement, but they're not really the fastest either. There's a good chance that they're not going to catch anything that your opponent doesn't want to be in close combat, so their options for charging might be limited. If they do get options though, certainly elite infantry, characters and monsters and vehicles are all absolutely fair game, with Furioso Dreadnoughts being able to put a real hurt on any hordes in your way as well. If you are using a dread from a Storm Raven, I'd probably think about deploying the Storm Raven at the back of the board where it's as safe as possible, if it will actually keep it safe from enemy fire back there. If it won't, if they have loads of enormously long range weapons that might well kill your Storm Raven turn 1, then it's probably best just to put it up front and centre, so at least if and when the Storm Raven dies, your Furioso Dreadnought can get out at the front and be that much closer to the enemy. Hopefully you'll get turn 1, then you can swoop your Storm Raven to somewhere where it will be inconvenient for a Dreadnought to get out for your opponent, but make sure that you don't allow the Storm Raven to get completely surrounded, because if you're in the middle of a massive horde of orc boys and there's nowhere to place the Furioso, then it will be destroyed if it can't be placed. It's got quite a big base, so it's not the easiest to be placed. I suspect after you've moved your Storm Raven up with a Dreadnought in it, the Storm Raven's almost certainly going to get targeted and killed, because it will be making a massive spectacle of itself right in the front of the enemy's army. It might well be worth including a small squad of something in the Storm Raven, as you really can't afford for you to roll a 1 and lose your Dreadnought. If you only have the Dreadnought in there, absolutely definitely 100% keep a command reroll safe until the Storm Raven dies, so you can reroll that 1 when it inevitably happens. From there you should be able to get a second turn charge, presuming your Furioso isn't gunned down too, and get stuck into something nasty. So let's talk a little bit about competitors to the Furioso and the Death Company Dreadnought. Their main niche is that they're much stronger in melee than the other Dreadnoughts, due to those re-rolling hits. Unfortunately, the Furioso with Frag Cannon has suddenly got a very deadly new contender in the Invicta Tactical Warsuit. It has almost the exact same profile as the Furioso, with a twin heavy flamer type weapon, and also a massive amount of small harms fire. I'm afraid in a straight comparison, the Invicta just wins stat-wise. It's massively tougher with 13 wounds, and I think that the small arms fire makes up for the lack of another heavy flamer, and it's not even significantly more expensive at all. The main advantages of the Dreadnought are that you can use the Dreadnought stratagems, including Duty Eternal, so it does still have a niche, and of course you can't transport an Invicta in a Storm Raven, but then you can't set up a Furioso Dreadnought 9 inches from the enemy, and boy would it enjoy that. Invictas with flamers or with autocannons are both ludicrously strong for the Blood Angels, and it's more a case of that being the case rather than the Furioso being a non-viable unit. This means that I think that the Death Company Dreadnought with the close combat weapons has a lot more of a niche, as he basically will outfight pretty much any other Dreadnought that you have access to. Other alternatives are of course the Redemptor and the Standard Pattern Dreadnought, and the Librarian Dreadnought, who has a lot of advantage of being Blood Angels and can also move with the speed of a Thunderbolt with Wings of Sanguinius. There are a lot of decent Dreadnought options out there. So I'm afraid I probably wouldn't use either of these in hyper-competitive games, but they remain very fun, fluffy options that can deal an absolute massive ton of damage if they get into melee, and I'm sure in plenty of games they will absolutely surprise you and cut a merry swath through the enemy army. As always, thank you for listening to Auspex Tactics. I'm looking forward to continuing our look at the Blood Angels over the next few weeks. If you'd like to see more, then please subscribe, and if you've been enjoying a lot of my videos, please feel free to support me on Patreon. Every little helps, I'd certainly like to do this more of a full-time thing. Again, thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.